Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're good. I'm still going to protect you from our intro blaring music. I'm still waiting on a finalised sort of design for the intro and outro of this show as we go into this year. I mean, I'm still cracking on without, but do let me know if what's the balance? Me just turning up as I am doing now, or do you want your blaring music? Because I'll give you that if you want. Give the crowd what they want. Thanks a lot for your participation last week. It was really interesting to get some of your thoughts, and certainly for those that have been sending your thoughts and comments on this, as we are letting you know what the titles are of some of our episodes and stuff. That's an interesting one because you guys are then sharing your thoughts and feelings about a subject ahead of time. So this was announced on social media last week that today we'll be talking about this topic. And so it just means that by me giving you a bit more notice, you guys can either choose to join and hopefully you are doing live, or after the fact you're having a watch or listen. But you also then contribute in your thoughts and feelings, be that on social media, private DMs, etc., or info@physio-matters.com. That is how you can reach me. It will get forwarded over to me. Any of your thoughts, be that after the fact or ahead of time. And I think this is one of those subjects that has been a really contentious one, and kind of rightly so. It's pretty serious stuff, but it's also one that seems to have really split opinion in many ways, which is probably what makes it so contentious. But I think when I was anticipating doing this and put this into the plan, and I've been asked by many people to cover this topic more thoroughly, I'd made my thoughts clear on various things, but just to try and have a bit of a debate about it, I then reached out to a number of people, that some of which had been vocal online, some of which I would have suspected had an opinion on this, and asked them to, do you fancy coming on the show on this date and having a discussion about it? And increasingly, on both sides of the argument, people weren't keen to do that. Now, I'm not going to read too much into that. It might not have really suited them in terms of time or what have you, but I doubt if I'd have gone public and sort of just said anything goes, who wants to talk on either side of this discussion. And it could well have been that we'd have found a debate to be had where I might be a sort of neutral third party of a sort, trying to work out what's what. But yeah, people were increasingly not keen to do that. And I think that's partly the sort of toxicity that can occur in these sorts of discussions, which is a shame. I will admit is disappointing. I think that's one of the things that's occurred full stop across, say, social media or in society at large, but also over this topic. There were people that I've got my opinions, even willing to share them, make a few notes, but then if asked to justify them in a discussion type setting, they weren't keen to do so. So I think some of that is that people are just like, I can do without the hassle. I'm just going to have to face down the angry mob on the other side of the argument to me, and I haven't got the time for that. That's part of it. But then there is also part of it whereby people don't have confidence in their convictions in such a way that then you wonder whether or not you should have convictions. There's some people that are really quite firm about their position on something, yet when challenged, it's actually on sort of wobbly foundations. And that, but for me, begs the question then, where does that confidence come from? Why is it that you can be so sure of yourself on something like this? I think it is a concern that people do end up feeling like they are on firmer ground than they are with regards to their opinion. And that's part of the human condition, and I'm no more immune to that than others. But it is interesting that this is something that I had penciled in well ahead of time, a few weeks ago, and since then been just looking for people that might want to come on and discuss it. I think that would be a nice format, really, and we'd have certainly kept it all amicable. But yeah, people on either side of the discussion didn't fancy joining to discuss it like that, and especially because I've been fairly forthright on this show in various different ones from last year. Means that my opinion's been fairly well known as someone that is against the NHS Vaccine Mandate, of which has been scrapped now, fortunately. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't learn from that. We shouldn't talk about some of the first principles, as well as then shining a light on some of the arguments across the piece of opinion here. But it's something that then potentially that colours things, that people feel like, my position's been made clear, and so I'm not a neutral arbiter on this, and very rarely a neutral arbiter on anything. I will admit and share my opinion, my take on things. I try and give everyone a fair shake and give all ideas a fair shake, but that's something that is potentially one of the things that's affected it. So let's get stuck in. One of the things that I wanted to do then today, especially those that are tuning in live, please would love for you guys to participate, and I'll draw you guys in. Hi to Talita, she said happy Monday. Yeah, it does feel like a fairly happy Monday, not as happy as a Friday, of course, but yes, it is indeed. Alison, hi, good to see you. So pleased you finally decided to cover this. I've been waiting. Lovely, yeah, we'll get stuck in now. Please do, both of you, as well as anyone else that's tuning in live, or again after the fact, of course, post your comments. Would love your thoughts on this, and we'll talk more about it, no doubt, if there is a hunger for it. But what I wanted to do on this show is to make sure that I represented what I think is sort of the strength of argument that can exist across both sides of this. I've admitted where I end up falling, and so that's smart for me to just admit to that ahead of time. I've given a lot of thought to this over many years of thinking about such matters, not necessarily this particular one, and so I have my opinion. But that doesn't mean that, hopefully I've considered the strength of argument across the board. So I feel like I'm, not in bad shape to try and present what it would be. So I'm going to start off, if I can, with the argument in favour of vaccine mandates in the NHS. So, of course, we're talking about the COVID vaccine, and we're talking about the fact that then people in healthcare, they're interacting with vulnerable patients. And so the argument being that the virus, of which has been discussed to high heaven, has its risks, its threat. It's a respiratory virus. It's quite transmittable, particularly different variants, namely Delta and Omicron, incredibly transmissible. The argument, certainly when it was first conceived, was that a vaccinated person is significantly less likely to transmit the virus to someone, and certainly then being in contact with many vulnerable people in the NHS means that to be vaccinated therefore makes you less of a vector for transmission, and therefore whilst you can have your own personal choice of not taking the vaccine, you then can't be employed in the health service. Of course, when we're thinking about that, that's our government job by extension, really, if you work in the health service, of which I did for 10 years. And so the argument being then that you want to decrease transmission to vulnerable people, and that the vulnerable people in the health service have no choice really as to who they are seen by much, and therefore the protection of them would involve then making sure that then if they'd be more safe if all of the people that they would come into contact with would be vaccinated by design. So that's the sort of centre of that argument. There is also then this angle whereby staff have had to have other vaccinations before in order as a condition of employment. And I'm pretty sure it's been hard to tease this out completely, but things like Hep C, etc., have been technically a vaccine mandate as a condition of employment. And so that's something that people have said, is that this is something that has been so devastating to the world, then you would have, it's such a thing that really it's only an addition to existing policy, has been one of the arguments I've heard. Obviously, I'm saying this by just presenting this now as a means of saying, as I started the show with, that I don't find these arguments to be particularly compelling, and I'll go into why. But it's something that I can understand that logic for various reasons. I can understand why people would feel that way. I can understand how devastating this has been for so many people and for society at large across many different countries, of course, in such a way that then there is a degree of sort of safety first mentality, lives over incomes type, lives over profit type logic, whereby whatever we can do to keep people safe, we will do. There's no such thing as too much PPE. There's no such thing as too intrusive a precaution, because we need to just keep people from each other's droplets and therefore to decrease transmission, particularly for those that are most vulnerable to this virus becoming very sick or becoming obviously then unfortunately many thousands of people dying. So you can understand that logic. It's seldom seen with an appropriate balance of trade-offs, which has been more of my criticism of the public debate at large, I guess, rather than it being just about this. That's rarely, things aren't particularly proportional these days. But I think that you can understand that being mainly the main primary. When I've asked people, unfortunately, those that didn't want to come on the show, but why is it that you support the NHS vaccine mandate? And it's just that everyone should have to do their bit, and that they're exposed to vulnerable people, decreasing the likelihood of transmission to the vulnerable from if they were vaccinated rather than not vaccinated. And that's been the pretty central one. There's then these additions when almost as if counted to say, as a condition of employment into the NHS, you had to have other vaccines. Why not this one? It's safe, it's effective. What's the problem? You need to do your bit and collaborate, and there should be consequences, if you make that choice. And that's one of the things that people have admitted to as well, is that people, I'm happy to use this language with regards to vaccine mandate, but there's people that have said that it's not a mandate. You've got a choice. You can not have the vaccine. You just can't have this job. That starts to be challenging to me for various reasons in the use of that language. But again, there is something to be said. Your freedom there is not freedom from the consequences of your decision, and so that is often what people have been saying as well, is that they don't feel that it's even a mandate. I think that if you define mandate as being something that then, if you have this vaccine or else, you're going to be pinned down by what is by someone, and that it's going to be mandatory to the point in which you're going to be injected against your forced will, then I think that's quite a narrow definition of mandate. I think if you make it particularly difficult for people to live in society, and in this case to professionally exert live out their trade, apply their trade. Say for me, obviously I can work elsewhere, but there are many NHS jobs that are only NHS jobs. Really, there isn't a private equivalent of which you can quickly pivot to. So if you want to apply your trade, your profession, your life's work, say you've been 25 years in the NHS as a I'm trying to think of something that's like really quite specifically NHS that there isn't a large market for elsewhere. I'm just going to go with radiologists just for the sake of this. There's such thing as private radiologists, of course, but there's a lot more in the NHS, I imagine, than private, and the private market wouldn't proliferate enough to take on a load. So I'm just meaning that if you did that for a long period of time, to then be said that you need to have this jab, otherwise you're getting sacked from that, it's not obvious that you'd then be able to go, oh, well, I'll take this very similar job elsewhere that will let me be not vaccinated. That's pretty close to a mandate. That's quite a massive disruption. And so that's me starting to deviate into then the other argument, really, is to the freedom to not be vaccinated. What are the arguments against it? Now, the primary one is one of essentially that being that someone does own their own body, rather than it being the being sort of coercive circumstances in which mainly the community or the country or the state at large or what have you owns someone's body. I think that's the thing that that people really, if pressed, come back with, including myself, really, as to why would you oppose the vaccine mandate. Above all else, it is the fact that I think it's a really useful and essential first principle that it would take for incredibly rare and drastic circumstances for an individual to not own their own body and have their own autonomy. And so that then becomes things like capacity under mental health, where we end up sometimes having to make those decisions, in childhood or in other disabilities and stuff is different. But for otherwise free and willing adults, then that have capacity under everything else legal, then it should be their decision and they should be persuaded to. And if we can't persuade people to, then you certainly can't don't make the mistake of making a policy that's a priori needs to persuade a certain amount more people than you're able to. I think that's where it gets into dangerous things if you then need to be coercive or forceful. And I think that's me just admitting to a philosophical ethical preference is that I do feel that it is wise for us to own our own bodies, and for us to therefore be responsible for that to some degree, but also able to then withhold our bodies to volunteer them to be injected, or to be able to reject that offer to be injected. And so that's the thing that's at the heart of it. If I'm honest, it's not where I check out and say that that's everything, but generally that's where obviously I stand, and where, if I'm honest, what I've found from asking a lot of people, you're for or against it and stuff, that the sort of most passionate arguments, it seems, or most common arguments seem to come from people that, admittedly, I share their views on this, is that, it's that is a point of principle of which we need to stand by, and that fundamentally it needs to be individual agency needs to come through there, because of you do own your own body, rather than it being the community, society, state, call it what you will, that then has rights over you that you don't, that you can't opt out of. Now, as I just mentioned before, it does get into a grey area. It's interesting because, of course, you feel free, some people, not everyone, but some people say, no, feel free to not get vaccinated. You will be socially shunned and isolated from society. You won't be allowed to work in these particular industries, or be able to then ply your trade that you have done for many years for these reasons, but you're still allowed to exist. You might have seen shows that I've done whereby I've sort of semi-satirized that a little bit, and I've said, should unvaccinated people be allowed to use roads? And my play there is to suggest that essentially roads are a public service that we pay through taxation. Are we making you could make a case under similar logic that, of course, you can choose to be unvaccinated, but you're just not allowed to participate on society, or if you are, you're not allowed to use these roads because that's what we pay for as with our taxes. And so that's where people have thought I was just being really facetious or totally hypothetical with that. But I'm not. I'm making a similar sort of point of principle, that if you start to then say that you should do your bit, and by doing your bit, you then qualify to live in society, and that's, we as a society have decided to then shun you and other you, by these definitions, then it's not dissimilar. It's not me making just some sort of strange slippery slope argument with regards to a condition of, with regards to a condition of employment whilst you're employed to take a vaccine or not within the NHS. It's not that dissimilar, and people need to sort of wake up a little bit to that, again, in my opinion. Now, one of the things that comes from some of the sideshow arguments, really, and where, admittedly, when you're weighing up pros and cons, I get dragged less into this. It's less interesting for me, as well as it being like, I don't want to be an armchair virologist that has a strong opinion on this either way. Right? I don't want to appeal to authority and just say, like, well, what do I know? Let's just go to Chris Whitty and et al. And just defer everything, right? In style. But equally, I'm not going to be someone that then thinks that they can get stuck into microbiology in such a way that then can sort of unearth some grand conspiracy by way of understanding the mechanisms of effect of all those sorts of things, not my expertise. So it's difficult, but fundamentally, I don't like to get dragged this way. But one of the things I will admit is that I don't think, on balance, that COVID-19, especially now, is dangerous enough for us to mandate something like this if it was Ebola. And then there's the second thing, is I don't think the COVID vaccines are nearly as good enough at, especially with regards to transmission decreasing the risk, of transmission, that's not the right language, as well as some of the other sort of third-party variables that are beyond your own sort of risks, that I don't think they're strong enough. So that balance of those two things does colour my opinion. And I think there are hypotheticals, there are thought experiments I can do, whereby if this was as dangerous as Ebola, and you had a vaccine that is literally just, well, as good as they said the COVID vaccines were going to be, which is to completely stop transmission in its tracks, stop you ever getting the disease, imagine it a bit like yellow fever vaccine, really, is that if you've had a yellow fever vaccine, you cannot get infected by yellow fever, you cannot pass on yellow fever, that sort of thing. And of course, one of the most famous vaccines of all time to have gone through years and years of now. It's been around for so many years now that they can be confident that you've got lifetime immunity, because it's been around so long that they've not had any cases of breakthroughs where that immunity diminishes, which is a powerful thing, right? So that that's where I will admit that whilst I don't like to get sucked into how dangerous is COVID and how good are the vaccines, because I think that, you know, they're both those things I would stand by. It's a dangerous and incredibly disruptive virus, but I would say that the vaccines aren't strong enough that could start to bend and the shape of my own sort of ethics as to autonomy that I mentioned earlier. You know, I hope that makes sense. I am saying that in a hypothetical situation, I can imagine me being in I can consider that if something is serious, a disease is serious enough, and a vaccine is good enough, then you could end up in a situation where, you know, it just becomes that you go right way back to first principles, and that wouldn't be a hill I would die on. Right, there would be evidence that could be presented that would skew me, but this isn't it. You know, I don't find either of those things on balance to exist. I don't think the virus is nearly dangerous enough, and I don't think the vaccines are nearly good enough to start to make that case here, especially to go against what I think is a real fundamental principle and right for human autonomy, especially given the caveats I've already put in play. Now, when it comes to then things like and Talita's made a few comments here I'll bring in a second about the other vaccines like Hep B and the like in healthcare as conditions of employment. The big one for me with people saying stuff like that is that they're missing a massively relevant difference, is that when you take up a job or go into a profession, right? So I had my mandatory vaccines and jabs and that when I was week one of physio school, right? You go, especially because you're integrated into the health system as a student, right? You can't opt out of that. And so it was a condition of employment, even then, as a student physio, was that you took these vaccines. And you're talking about things that were just, they're a massively different prospect. You know, I remember pausing for thought briefly at the time, but it was just something that the sort of the safety profile of them, the duration, the mitigation of adverse events, etc., was just so well known, you know, decades of data type stuff, as well as the fact that you're making a choice there as someone that is otherwise not employed in that area, and making a decision to do that, knowing that that is a condition of employment as you enter. That is very different for a couple of reasons. The main one being that you're in employment, you're in existing employment, everything's well, I'm assuming you're fine and good and competent at your job. And then this is why it's a mandate that has you being fired from an existing trajectory is very different to an entry point. That's the main thing that's different about that when people say, well, it's just another job you have to have. The second point is that there is a real relevant difference, even though, you know, for me, looking on, I see no reason to be concerned about the broader efficacy and safety necessarily of the vaccines. That's something I've given a lot of thought to for myself and for my family, and that, you know, it's something that realistically, you know, we're talking about you know, working age adults and stuff. I see it as being considering the amount of doses of this stuff that we've got. There's still some concerns. I don't like the way in which some of those concerns are hushed down culturally and through media, etc. That's a slightly different thing. But generally speaking, that's not my point. But the issue that comes from them people that are concerned over the timeframes of which this was produced and rolled out, etc., and the enthusiasm of which people are keen to put 7 doses of it into people over the course of whatever duration of time, I can understand as to why they might, compared to yellow fever, they end up being in a different situation, you know. And I think that's where they're not like for like, right? Entry point of employment versus existing employment, that's different. But then also yellow fever vaccine as one example versus COVID vaccine, it's different animals completely. As well as then you pick something like hepatitis, you've then got this severity issue with regards to it, as well as the effectiveness of the vaccine, like I used in my example with regards to Ebola. So yeah, I'm going to pull these comments from Talita up. I'm not sure whether or not it'd be fun if she's disagreeing or agreeing, I don't know, but always trust Talita's comments, so let's read them live. To the best of my knowledge, other vaccines, Hep B, TB, etc., were not mandatory. They've been in circulation for a number of years, and as such, have been further developed and fine-tuned. Also, there's the aspect of employment law and effectively changing a person's employment contract by mandating something like a vaccine after they've become employed. This is brilliant. Talita, I think she posted this before I said it, so it's amazing. Yeah, 10 minutes ago she posted these. When going into a new job, however, it's part of your employment conditions. It's definitely different as you take on that job based on those particular conditions. Yeah, I mean that's the thing that I end up feeling like, really. And thank you, Talita, for that. It's really useful. And it sounds like we do agree in the main on that for sure. I see nothing there, by the way, that I disagree with. I say in the main because I don't want you to have to get bandwagon to all of my views on this or anything. But yeah, I think that those distinctions are really relevant. I think it's a shame when people are so dismissive of it. Bernadette, hi Bernadette, former Tune It Over guest, of course, Bernadette Johnson. Isn't it the same with university mandatory vaccines, or you can't go? Is this entry point for employment? Yeah, I think the thing is, it's considered entry point for employment because of the way in which you're integrated. I don't think you've got mandatory vaccines to go to university. Like I remember when I started, and my friends from halls and stuff. I remember in that freshers week, and we're all bleary eyed. I was the only one having to go for jabs because they were studying economics and civil engineering and stuff like that. So I'm pretty sure it wasn't a condition of employment into the universities. As a student physio, you did. I mean, because you ended up having, you had all sorts of stuff you needed to do for that because you were going to be a student member of the NHS essentially, and you were going to your 1,000 hours service that you did ahead of your graduation. That was something that was really relevant, and so I think that is why it's considered an entry point of employment. I always felt and remembered it as such. You know, it's something that you really did as a student. You felt like you worked, you contributed to, you worked in the NHS, and you were slightly different, definitely as a student to once you were graduated. But yeah, that was something that I considered to be, and then when I look back, that's how it was quite a different feel to it, and also one that there's just less consequence to that, isn't there? Say someone decides to not want to have a vaccine, to therefore decides not to go into that profession or that job or that sector or whatever. There's fewer consequences to that than someone losing their livelihood. Especially if you think about the way in which the world works, particularly financially. Say that I worked in the NHS. I mean, it's difficult this because there's so many hypotheticals here. Because I have, for those that don't know, I have been vaccinated. But say I worked in the NHS and I've chosen not to be vaccinated for whatever reason, and my mortgage is based on my income. You've got the social aspects, of course, that could apply to any job really, but you've kind of sometimes got a sort of factor around that as well. What is contained around someone's entire existence that can sometimes be pivoted, be around their employment, but also just the implications of losing someone's sense of purpose. We've not even mentioned yet the contribution that they make to society at large, being in healthcare in these times, or the massive risk it was going to pose to the NHS to lose staff, which they would have done. Even if it was just a few, they would lose staff at a time where it's difficult to recruit, as well as then decreasing the recruitment pool because there's people that would otherwise be unvaccinated. And so it's just not what the health system needs. It's definitely a supplementary argument to why I would oppose it and why I did oppose it. I was always pleased to see it scrapped. I'll be honest, though, I wasn't jumping for joy, partly because I don't think it got scrapped because the ethical arguments got won out. I think it's all politics. I can see a number of people that I know, like, and trust in the industry that just couldn't help but feel that they were very dismissive of these sorts of discussions because they're like, look, I've had my jabs, you should have your jabs, just do your bit, get on with it, stop being a tinfoil hat wearer if you're against them. And then there's people, especially in other countries, especially you Aussies, you've got politicians that are saying there's no difference between being against vaccination and against vaccine mandates. They have been quite open about saying you're an anti-vaxxer if you're any one of three categories: against the vaccine mandate, you're against vaccines, against the COVID vaccine, you're against all vaccines, or you're a proponent of vaccine conspiracies, right? They're not saying that there's any relevant distinction between all these different categories and stuff. And that, for me, is just, it's nonsense for one, but because that's quite demonstrable nonsense to me. That those are, is to lump that stuff is a massive category error. But I would say beyond that, it's something that is dangerous to the discussion. And so I don't feel like a good, healthy debate has then been decided on and then won by the scrapping of the mandate. I'm very concerned that we've not had a sensible, open dialogue about this more broadly. And I think really what we need to consider is how can we learn from this? Is there any way we can get some sort of public square fired up, where we can start to have important and broad conversations with each other again? Because I do get concerned for that. I'm always concerned about that. I'm a chat show host at the end of the day, not just here, but on Physio Matters and Therapy Live, and all those different things I do is just trying to elicit conversation, and try and have important discussions about important topics. And if we, how worried am I that that's gone by the wayside? I'm not sure, but I know that the scrapping of this mandate that wasn't because of the conclusion of a really healthy public debate. No, that was politics and polling and political controversies and stuff, and said knobhead with the silly hair in number 10. And so we need to just start to think more carefully about, right, how can we prepare ourselves for having conversations about things like bodily autonomy, etc. And it's something we need to start stripping things back further towards base principles in order to get our shit together, rather than thinking that these things can be just political footballs and their policies, and oh well, we gave it a go, and what's it matter? I think that's I do think we end up in a real state of peril if we don't improve that. So that's why I did this show anyway. Hopefully I've just given a fair shake to different types of arguments on this. I've admitted my opinion and bias on this, but also what I suggest the lessons we should learn is to get back to first principles so that we can not make this mistake every time. Thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it. And I'll see you on Friday. We're going to be getting stuck back into the knee. We're going to talk about modalities around the knee, what's taping, strapping, rubbing, that sort of stuff, injecting, what is or isn't legit, but also what circumstances might we do that. So we're going to get clinical on Friday. Looking forward to it. Thanks a lot for all those of you that have contributed, and please do. Sorry, if I didn't get to your comments elsewhere, but do feel free to post them. We'll see them after the fact, or info@physio-matters.com if you'd like to email your opinions, or certainly if you'd like to come on the show. All right, take care. Have a good day.